The war had ended, but for the men in grey uniforms crowded inside the rattling train cars rolling through the English countryside, it didn't feel like peace. They sat in silence, staring through the small, soot-streaked windows, each man wrapped in thoughts of what awaited him. They had fought for Hitler, some willingly, some by fear or duty. Now they were prisoners, defeated soldiers being sent to the land they had helped to bomb. And though the guns had fallen silent, their hearts still braced for war. Rumors had followed them since capture, that the British would take revenge, that prisoners were being forced into mines or starved in secret camps. The stories were enough to make the younger ones tremble, though they tried to hide it behind blank stares. A few of the older soldiers muttered prayers. One man, a former baker from Cologne named Dieter, whispered to his friend, "They will make us pay for what we've done." The other only nodded. When the train finally slowed, they caught glimpses of green fields, hedgerows, and small cottages, a landscape too peaceful to belong to a nation that had survived the Blitz. Yet as they stepped onto the station platform, guarded by polite British soldiers who neither shouted nor shoved, the prisoners' confusion deepened. The guards didn't look at them with hatred. They looked tired. In the months after May 1945, Britain had inherited an enormous and unexpected burden, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war scattered across Europe. Instead of sending them back immediately, the government made a controversial decision to bring many of them to Britain itself. The country was short of labor, farms needed workers, and the rebuilding of bombed cities demanded manpower. These prisoners, officials decided, would work, but no one could have predicted what that decision would create. At first, resentment ran deep. Newspapers questioned why the government was feeding the enemy while British families still lived under rationing. Letters poured into Parliament demanding that the Boche be kept behind barbed wire, far from civilians. Yet on quiet mornings in the countryside, the reality looked very different. Trucks carrying German POWs rumbled through narrow lanes to farms where old men and women waited for help. In Hertfordshire, a farmer named Albert Thorne received word that 2 German prisoners would be assigned to assist with the harvest. He didn't like the idea. His cousin had been killed at El Alamein. His wife still jumped at the sound of thunder, mistaking it for bombs. When the army truck arrived, Albert folded his arms as 2 thin young men stepped down, their uniforms ragged, their faces expressionless. One of them, tall and blonde, tried to offer a handshake. "Guten Morgen, sir," he said softly. Albert didn't move. He pointed toward the fields. "Tools are in the shed. Get to work." They worked all morning in silence, swinging scythes beneath the August sun, sweat glinting on their brows. When noon came, Albert's wife, Mabel, brought tea and sandwiches. She watched the prisoners for a long moment, then disappeared back inside. When she returned, she carried 2 extra cups and some bread spread with jam. She handed them to the Germans without a word. For a moment, they simply stared, unable to believe it. Then one whispered, "Danke." That small gesture became a story retold in whispers across the camp that night. The men who had expected punishment couldn't comprehend such simple kindness. All over Britain, similar moments unfolded. Guards discovered that discipline was easier to maintain when they treated the prisoners fairly. Villagers saw that these young men weren't monsters. They were just exhausted boys who wanted to survive. Children began to wave at them as their trucks passed. Some locals slipped cigarettes or apples through the fences. The barbed wire remained, but something invisible had begun to dissolve. For the prisoners, daily life was a strange blend of confinement and freedom. They slept in wooden huts, woke before dawn, and marched out under guard to work on farms or clear rubble. But compared to the stories they had heard about Soviet or French camps, this was paradise. They were fed adequately, allowed to write home, even attend church services. The British officers expected hard work, but they also expected dignity. One British sergeant, interviewed years later, recalled how his orders were simple. "They are not beasts, they are men. Treat them as you would want your son to be treated if he were captured." Slowly, something shifted. On some farms, guards stopped carrying rifles altogether. Farmers began calling their workers by name instead of by number. A few families, noticing how far from home these men were, invited them to tea on Sundays. Many British wives, still wearing black armbands for sons or brothers lost in battle, found themselves sitting across the table from the very nationality they blamed. And yet the conversation would begin, hesitant, broken English, awkward smiles, and something human would spark between them. For many prisoners, this compassion was bewildering. One of them later wrote in his journal, "I thought they would beat us. Instead, they offered us tea. I could not understand it." But understanding wasn't necessary. The acts themselves began to heal. By late 1946, over 300,000 German POWs lived in Britain. Camps dotted the countryside from Wales to Scotland. They sang quietly in the evenings, carved toys for local children, and painted murals inside their huts, scenes of forests, families, and home. Some British Guards began joining in. A few small bands even formed, mixing German folk songs with English ballads. The most astonishing transformations happened not in cities or political offices, but in quiet rural corners. There were stories of POWs helping to rebuild barns after storms, of villagers knitting scarves for them in winter, of British children learning their first German words. And there were other moments too, darker ones. A few British men refused to forgive. They would spit as the prisoners passed, muttering about brothers lost at Dunkirk. The wounds of war ran deep, and kindness couldn't erase every scar. Yet even these confrontations changed over time. When one POW named Otto helped rescue a farmer's child trapped beneath a fallen cart, that same farmer, who once cursed the sight of Germans, began defending them in the village pub. "He saved my boy," the man would say. "Enemy or not, he's got a good heart." Inside the camps, news from Germany arrived slowly. Letters spoke of ruined cities, starving families, mothers scavenging in rubble. Many prisoners broke down upon reading them, and yet in these moments, British chaplains and guards often became the ones offering comfort. "You'll go home soon," they'd say, "and when you do, help rebuild, not destroy." For some Germans, those words became a kind of redemption. The transformation was not organized propaganda. It was quiet, personal, and profoundly human. No one issued orders to be kind, people simply chose it. A local teacher in Lincolnshire wrote in her diary, "I watched a man who once flew over us in war, now repairing our school roof. I expected to hate him. Instead, I thanked him." The idea spread. Forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was strength. Still, for the prisoners, uncertainty lingered. They didn't know when they would be released or what would remain of their homes. Each night, as frost crept through the wooden barracks, many wondered if this strange mercy was temporary. If one morning they'd be told they were being sent to harsher lands. Others began to dream differently. They spoke of staying. One man, Heinrich Müller, confided to his guard that he had fallen in love with a local girl who brought books to the camp fence. "She reads to me Dickens," he said shyly, "in English." The guard laughed, but didn't report it. Relationships between prisoners and locals were officially discouraged, but love, like forgiveness, ignored rules. By the winter of 1947, the landscape of Britain was changing. Rationing persisted, the economy was frail, but in the villages near the camps, something remarkable had taken root. A fragile peace between people who only 2 years earlier would have killed each other on sight. And as Christmas approached that year, one story spread from camp to camp, a story that would come to symbolize this unexpected humanity. It began in a small village hall, where an aging priest made an unusual request. He wanted the German prisoners to build the town's nativity scene, to show the community that reconciliation was possible. At first, villagers protested. "They burned our churches," one woman said, but the priest insisted. "They are also sons of God," he replied. The prisoners worked for days, carving figures from scrap wood, Mary, Joseph, and a child in a cradle made from old ammunition boxes. When the display was finished, the villagers gathered to see it. No one spoke. Some cried. That night, for the first time, the prisoners were invited into the church to attend midnight mass beside the villagers. British and German voices rose together in hymns of peace. For the men who had boarded those trains months earlier, expecting hatred, it was an unthinkable moment. But it was only the beginning of what was to come. Because soon, some of those German POWs would face a choice that would test the depth of that forgiveness, whether to return to a broken homeland or remain in the country that had once been their enemy. And that decision would change countless lives on both sides of the barbed wire. When the first wave of German prisoners arrived at the rural camps scattered across Britain, they expected hostility. They braced for vengeance, for the sneering looks of victors ready to humiliate their enemies. Instead, they found quiet fields, disciplined guards, and a society trying, despite its own wounds, to move forward. The war had ended, but the echo of its violence still lingered in every bombed street and grieving home. Yet somehow, against that backdrop of loss, compassion began to bloom. In those first weeks, the POWs were struck by how the British soldiers treated them, not as animals or war criminals, but as men who had fought for a cause they perhaps no longer believed in. There were strict rules, of course, searches, curfews, rationed food, but also respect. They were called men, not Huns or Nazis. It was a small thing, yet it carried immense meaning for prisoners who had been told by their commanders that the British would despise them. One of them, a young Bavarian farmer named Karl Müller, would later recall the moment he realized something had shifted inside him. "The sergeant brought us tea," he said in an interview years later. "I couldn't believe it. Tea for me, a German soldier. I was their enemy just a few weeks ago, but he handed it to me like I was a man, not a monster." That simple act, a mug of tea offered across the Gulf of War, became a symbol of everything that followed. The British countryside had turned into a patchwork of temporary camps, each one home to hundreds of Germans. Some were built near old RAF airfields, others beside quiet villages surrounded by rolling hills. The locals were cautious at first. Children were told to stay away from the barbed wire fences. Newspapers called them the enemy in our midst. But curiosity, as always, proved stronger than fear. Farmers soon realized the POWs could help rebuild the land that war had scarred. The men were strong, disciplined, and skilled with their hands. When spring came in 1946, British farmers began requesting German labourers to help plough their fields and repair barns. The arrangement was practical. It solved a manpower shortage, but something deeper grew out of it. Working side by side, the British and the Germans began to talk. At first, just simple words: tools, crops, weather, then bit by bit stories. A young German who had once driven tanks in North Africa learned how to mend fences from a Yorkshire farmer. Another, who had lost his brother at Stalingrad, found himself laughing with an English boy as they fed chickens. This was not the reunion of enemies, but the birth of reluctant friendships. Karl Müller was assigned to a small village near Suffolk, working on a farm owned by an elderly couple, Arthur and Margaret Barnes. They had lost their only son, Thomas, in the war. His plane had been shot down over France, and they never received his body. When Karl arrived, Arthur barely spoke to him. He saw only the uniform, the insignia, the reminder of the man who had taken his son's place in the earth. But Margaret, though quiet, brought Karl bread and tea during breaks. She didn't speak German, but kindness doesn't need translation. One afternoon, after a long day clearing debris from an old barn, Karl noticed a framed photo in their house. It was Thomas, young, smiling, in an RAF uniform. He hesitated before saying softly, "He looks my age." Margaret nodded. For a long time, neither spoke. That silence, heavy but gentle, marked the moment when resentment began to dissolve. Stories like this multiplied across Britain. POWs joined church services, played in local football matches, and even helped rebuild schools. Children waved at them through fences. British guards began to allow the men more freedom, recognizing their good behavior. By 1947, many POWs were permitted to walk to nearby villages under supervision. Some were even invited into homes for Sunday lunch. For the British public, these changes were subtle but significant. The propaganda of war had painted Germans as monsters. Yet now they were just men fixing fences, mending roads, or singing songs after work. The line between enemy and neighbour blurred. One of the most remarkable aspects of this transformation came from the British government itself. Officials introduced re-education programs designed to prepare POWs for life after captivity. The goal wasn't to punish them, but to instill democratic values and counter Nazi ideology. Camps hosted lectures on democracy, freedom, and responsibility. Some Germans resisted at first, suspicious of propaganda, but many, like Karl, listened intently. For the first time, he would later say, "I heard what freedom meant in practice, not as a slogan shouted by men in uniform." Evenings in the camps became moments of unexpected humanity. The Germans formed orchestras, staged plays, and held debates. British villagers were invited to attend, curious to see what these men, once their enemies, had to say. A choir of German voices singing hymns in a makeshift chapel brought some listeners to tears. For many British families, it was a reminder that forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was courage. Meanwhile, love quietly crept into some of these stories. It was technically forbidden for POWs to form relationships with local women, but hearts rarely obey rules. British girls working in fields or local shops found themselves drawn to the young German men who were polite. Hard-working and far from home, there were whispers, secret letters, and occasional scandal. When some of these couples eventually married after the men's release, it caused both outrage and admiration. Love, it seemed, could bridge even the deepest wounds of war. By 1948, Britain faced a new question: what to do with the thousands of German prisoners who had not yet been repatriated. Many didn't want to return home. Their towns lay in ruins, their families were gone. Some feared being sent back to Soviet-occupied zones. They had found something in Britain they didn't expect: dignity, purpose, even a sense of belonging. Local communities began petitioning the government to let certain men stay. Farmers who had worked with them vouched for their character. Church leaders wrote letters in their defense. They are no longer our enemies, one vicar wrote. They are our brothers in labor and peace. Slowly, Britain began granting permission for some to remain. Karl was among them. The Barneses had grown to see him not as a prisoner, but as the son they had lost. When his release order came, Arthur shook his hand for the first time. "You've worked hard," he said, his voice unsteady. "If you want to stay, we'll help you." Karl stayed in Suffolk, married a local woman, and opened a small carpentry workshop. Years later, his children would speak perfect English, unaware that their father had once worn the uniform of the enemy. Across the country, similar stories unfolded. Former POWs became bakers, builders, teachers. Some returned to Germany and helped rebuild it with a new perspective, one shaped not by hate but by mercy. The quiet revolution that had begun in those British fields left an indelible mark on both nations. The British people had chosen empathy over vengeance, and the Germans had responded with gratitude and humility. It was proof that even in the aftermath of horror, decency could prevail. But the transformation wasn't universal. Some British citizens, especially those who had lost loved ones, couldn't accept it. For them, forgiveness felt like betrayal. They protested when POWs walked freely in villages or attended dances. "They killed our sons," one widow shouted at a town meeting. "And now you're breaking bread with them?" Her anger was understandable. Her grief was still fresh. Yet even she couldn't stop the slow tide of reconciliation that was reshaping the nation. Time softened the edges of hate. The men who had once fought across the trenches now built together, prayed together, and shared cups of tea in the same pubs. Their uniforms were gone, but the lessons they carried remained. The story of German POWs in Britain wasn't about victors or losers. It was about what happens when ordinary people choose compassion over revenge. It showed that healing doesn't come from forgetting the past, but from facing it with open hearts. And as the sun set on post-war Britain, the fences that once divided enemies slowly came down, not with force, but with kindness. Years passed, and the barbed wire fences that once surrounded the prisoner of war camps vanished, swallowed by grass and time. But the memories, those small human gestures exchanged between former enemies, remained alive in the hearts of those who had lived through it. By the early 1950s, most of the German POWs who had chosen to stay in Britain were no longer viewed with suspicion. They were neighbors, workers, fathers, husbands. The transformation was almost invisible yet profound, a quiet victory for decency in a century scarred by brutality. For men like Karl Müller, life had taken an unexpected course. He no longer carried the shadow of the uniform that once defined him. Instead, he carried calloused hands, the scent of pine wood, and the laughter of his children in the garden. The local villagers had long accepted him. Some even sought him out for furniture repairs or carpentry lessons. Occasionally, a few elderly veterans would glance at him with a flicker of old resentment, but most had learned to let it go. After all, hadn't they too fought for a cause they barely understood? In the evenings, Karl would sit outside his small workshop, watching the fields turn gold in the fading light. It was a sight that reminded him of home, the rolling farmland of Bavaria. But here it felt different, peaceful, unburdened. Sometimes he'd remember the faces of the men he'd left behind in the camps, those who had returned to Germany and found only rubble. He wrote letters to a few of them, describing how the English villagers had treated him. They did not forget what happened, he wrote, but they chose not to let hate define them. That single choice, choosing not to hate, had shaped an entire generation's reconciliation. Meanwhile, historians began to take notice of what had quietly unfolded across Britain. They called it one of the most remarkable social experiments of the post-war era, the peaceful integration of more than 400,000 German POWs. Scholars wrote about how Britain had turned from conqueror to caretaker, from jailer to teacher. And though politics and policy played their roles, the true change came not from the top, but from ordinary people, from the farmer who shared his lunch with a German prisoner, from the widow who forgave the man wearing her enemy's badge, from the young child who waved through a wire fence and saw not a monster, but a man. In villages across Lincolnshire, Norfolk, and Kent, reminders of those years still lingered. Old farm buildings once used as barracks stood abandoned, their walls etched with German names. Some locals left them untouched, as quiet memorials to a time when compassion triumphed over bitterness. In a few places, annual gatherings were held, British families and former POWs meeting to share stories, drink tea, and remember the strange twist of fate that had turned prisoners into friends. At one such gathering in 1965, an aging British guard named Harold Cooper met with several Germans he had once supervised. He had been a young sergeant in charge of a camp near York. He confessed that at first he'd been filled with anger. "I lost my brother in France," he told them, "and when they sent me to guard Germans, I thought it was some kind of cruel joke." But his anger faded with every small kindness he witnessed. Prisoners repairing broken roofs, helping villagers with harvests, sharing food when rations were short. "You showed me," Harold said, "that a uniform doesn't make a man good or bad, his heart does." The room fell silent, and one of the Germans, an older man with grey hair and tired eyes, stood up and shook Harold's hand. "And you showed us that victory doesn't have to mean humiliation," he said. "It can mean mercy." Moments like that became the true legacy of the German POWs in Britain. Their presence, once seen as a threat, had instead become a bridge, a living testament to the idea that forgiveness is not weakness but strength. Yet even decades later, not everyone understood. When stories of POWs marrying British women first appeared in newspapers, there was outrage in some quarters. Letters poured in, accusing the women of betraying their country. But those women, brave in their own quiet ways, ignored the scorn. They built families rooted in two nations' pain and two nations' healing. Their children, born of reconciliation, would grow up hearing both languages at the dinner table, learning that love had no enemy. Carl's eldest son, David, grew up curious about his father's past. When he was old enough, Carl took him to the overgrown remains of the old POW camp where he had once lived. They stood beside the rusted gate, the wind whistling through broken wood. "I came here in chains," Carl said softly, "and I left a free man. But not because of bars or guards, because people saw me for who I could be, not what I had been." David listened, silent but wide-eyed. "Do you hate them?" he asked. Carl smiled faintly. "No," he said. "Hate is what brought me here. Forgiveness is what let me stay." That line, simple yet heavy with truth, would stay with David his whole life. Years later, he would tell it to his own children as they sat around the dinner table in the same Suffolk home where his father had once been a stranger. By the 1980s, the story of the German POWs had faded from popular memory. Britain had moved on, focused on rebuilding and modernization. But in quiet corners, in dusty archives and small-town museums, the stories survived. Letters, photographs, and journals from both sides painted a picture far more complex than wartime propaganda ever allowed. In those faded pages, the humanity of both nations shone through. One document, written by a British camp warden, captured the spirit of that era perfectly. "They came to us as enemies," he wrote. "But we soon learnt that suffering speaks the same language. When a man misses his family, it doesn't matter what flag he once fought under." And in Germany, too, the memory lived on. Many former POWs who had returned home spoke fondly of their time in Britain. Some even sent Christmas cards to their old guards or employers, maintaining friendships across borders once soaked in blood. To them, Britain wasn't just a place of captivity, it was a place where they rediscovered their humanity. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, a reunion was held in Suffolk for surviving British families and former German POWs. Karl Müller, then in his 70s, attended with his son. The event was simple: tea, photographs, quiet conversations. A local reporter interviewed him and asked, "What do you remember most from those years?" Karl thought for a long moment before answering. "I remember being afraid," he said, "afraid of what the British would do to us. But instead, they gave us something I didn't expect: dignity. They treated us as men, and that's something I will never forget." As the sun set that evening, the old veterans and villagers stood together for a final photograph. British and German hands rested on each other's shoulders, the weight of history between them, but no longer dividing them. When the image was printed in the newspaper the next day, the caption read, "Enemies once, now friends forever." The story of the German POWs in Britain isn't one of battles or politics. It's a story of human choices, of kindness in the aftermath of cruelty, of compassion in the shadow of destruction. It reminds us that peace is not just the absence of war, it is the presence of understanding. In every war, there are those who choose to hate and those who choose to heal. The British families who opened their doors, the German prisoners who worked in their fields, the guards who laid down resentment, all of them became architects of peace, brick by brick, handshake by handshake. Today, if you travel through the English countryside, you might pass a small churchyard or an old farm where one of those former POWs once worked. The traces of their stories linger in the wood of a barn they rebuilt, in the smile of an old photograph, in the quiet gratitude passed down through generations. And maybe, just maybe, that's the greatest legacy of all, that in a world torn apart by war, ordinary people, armed with nothing more than empathy, proved that humanity can survive anything. If this story moved you, remember that history isn't just about nations and treaties, it's about people, about what we choose to do when the war inside us finally ends. So, as you leave this story behind, take its lesson with you. Forgiveness is stronger than hate, and mercy is the bridge between enemies. Because once upon a time, German POWs in Britain expected cruelty, but what they found instead was humanity.